Little Sherry followed the floating form down into the basement of her parents' colonial-era plantation home as they unloaded boxes and furniture. She wasn't afraid at all. She felt safe because the talking shadow seemed very friendly. It even smiled at her. She was very curious to find out what the big secret was. Only the dark cloud leading the way knew. Sherry's mother wasn't immediately worried. She just assumed her 4-year-old daughter was curious and wandering around their new house. When she didn't respond right away, she called out to her a second time. After that, each subsequent attempt to summon her was met with equal failure. Concern escalated to worry. Worry transitioned to white-knuckle fear. In an elevated level of frenzy, she enlisted her husband to help track her down. The two of them split up to cover more ground, but their search proved fruitless. After crisscrossing every room of the property at least twice, they expanded their search to include the exterior grounds and nearby woods. Both parents were hoarse from yelling and screaming her name. Mrs. Baylock was just about to call the police when little Sherry came outside to find out what all the commotion was about. She had no idea her parents were hysterical because they couldn't find her. "Oh my gosh, Sherry! Where were you? Your dad and I have been looking for you everywhere. We've been calling you. We were terrified you were lost. Didn't you hear us shouting your name?" Sherry was genuinely bewildered. She hadn't heard them at all. They seemed very mad at her. It made her start to cry because she didn't want them angry. "Mommy, I was with Maurice in the basement." Mrs. Baylock was doubly perplexed. "Who is Maurice? And where in the basement? Both your father and I went down there looking for you. I didn't see you, Sherry, neither did your father. We were frightened." "Maurice is my new friend, Mama. He's a dark cloud man. He showed me a hidden doorway down there that leads into a secret room. I was talking to him in the dark. I'm sorry I did him." Both of her clothing. There were no obvious signs of foul. She tried to ask in the most casual way possible, while hiding her rising level of apprehension. "Maurice lives in our basement, but he told me he doesn't like talking to grown-ups. He says they are too judgmental, but I don't know what that means. I think he'll hide if you call him, Mommy." Mr. Blaylock wielded a large crescent wrench and walked down to the basement. Behind him, his wife and daughter followed. They needed her to show where the secret door was. If they really had a vagrant man squatting in their house, he would be anxious to get out. He witnessed the heavy weapon in Charles's hand. Sherry pointed to an ordinary-looking place on the wall. When prodded further, she explained how to activate the secret door. When it flew open, both adults could hardly believe it. Neither a secret door nor a hidden room had been disclosed on the real estate tour or the deed. Both of them secretly considered that Sherry might have accidentally discovered the hidden room and made up an imaginary playmate, but that seemed far-fetched. A close examination of the hidden room failed to reveal any intruders. They had their daughter back, and she seemed unharmed. Accepting the imaginary friend explanation was the easiest way to swallow, so they just both went with it. There were a lot of boxes to unpack and furniture to put in place. Maurice was soon forgotten. Neither of them had time to ponder what the odds were of a 4-year-old to discover a hidden room by herself. The very first time she was down in the basement, it was just a little too weird to dwell on. The thing is, Sherry volunteered a number of other things about their colonial home which she wouldn't have any insight into. She offered them interesting and historically accurate details, which she wasn't privy to. It baffled and fascinated them, but they deliberately avoided inquiring how she came to know these things. They were secretly afraid to know. It was a subtle form of parental denial. "Maurice told me." Finally hearing those words as an explanation made ice run through her veins. Janet felt it difficult to breathe. They had deliberately avoided asking her any more about her imaginary friend, in hopes that she would forget him. At her tender age of development, she could barely even pronounce the uncommon name. It seemed reasonable she'd eventually forget. Despite the willful reasoning, Maurice kept popping back up as Sherry's mysterious and unofficial source of knowledge about their 200-year-old plantation estate. "What's a slave, Mommy?" Janet was so startled by the abrupt, unusual question that she dropped the saucer under her coffee cup. It shattered on the floor with an ugly bang. Despite the loss of the matching dish, she was grateful for the brief reprieve from answering the uncomfortable question. "Where did you hear that word?" she managed to choke out. Even before the words formed in her daughter's mouth, she knew what they were going to be. "Maurice told us he used to be a slave when he lived here in the house a long time ago. I just don't know what that means. He said you would explain it to me." It was the first time her daughter's friend had directly invoked her. Holding back the denial was getting increasingly difficult. They were all just pretending to pretend. Now this Maurice was prodding Sherry to ask questions. He was pushing for his supernatural existence to finally be acknowledged. She didn't know what to do next, or how detailed to get in her answer. Was he watching them? Would he be offended if she simplified her answer to not trouble her daughter's 4-year-old mind? Her husband was still in deep denial, but she decided it was time to face the literal apparition in the room. She went downstairs during Sherry's nap and opened the hidden door. It was the first time she'd been back inside the secret room since finding out about it, well-intentioned. The thought of being alone with a so-called dark cloud sent shivers up her spine. She didn't know anymore. I am Maurice Littlefield. I was born in 1741, in what is brought to this country by a British slave ship. The previous owner of the plantation purchased me to serve his family. I did so faithfully until my passing in 1809. For reasons that are unknown to me, I've been a guest here ever since. As the house servant, these were my personal quarters. It was as more than 200 years in apology. I'm very sorry. I mean no disrespect, daughter, when you moved in. She's precious, and a great blessing to you and your husband. I never had any children of my own, but I was entrusted with caring for the young boys and girls of this house by the master of the plantation. I have a great love for children, and am saddened that I never had the chance to become a father myself. Playing hide-and-seek, Red Rover, or a few other childhood games with little Sherry is about the only joy I have left anymore. I beg your forgiveness. I meant no harm. Janet's heart melted from Maurice's bittersweet explanation of loneliness. I understand your need to interface with people in general. But why do you hide yourself from myself and my husband? Couldn't we also be a source of comfort?
Madam, only young children can see me in my present form and not be afraid, because their minds are not so set in their ways. Seeing me as I am would gravely frighten you, because you see the world through the eyes of an adult. Sherry and the little ones who lived here, the past were not hardened by the adult expectation of normal. That's why I felt so much joy when your precious family moved in. There hasn't been any children in here in many years to see me without judgment.
Mr. Littlefield, I understand now. I can't say how my husband would react if he knew the truth, but I know you have the purest of intentions. I don't mind you being my daughter's special friend. May she bring you as much joy as humanly possible until she reaches the age where she can no longer handle the realities of your unique friendship. After that, there lies the possibility of more children from us, and grandchildren a few more years down the road. May all of the future children in this house bring you peace and laughter. Bless you, Maurice Littlefield. So quoth this raven. I asked Bo about this one for the Dr. Creepin special, which is upcoming in the middle of, for an extra who lost their partner, but it didn't turn out that way. So I am sharing it here with you guys. I hope you enjoy. And so, on. The Rotten House by Dry Wit, Dry Wine. Bridget Richards? The voice on the other end of the line sounded somber and familiar. Yes, this is she. This is Helen Nichols, your old neighbor. I have some bad news, dear. Your mother has passed. I had been dreading this phone call for the last 20 years, since the night my mother kicked me out and told me never to come back. It was my 16th birthday. Mom was working the morning shift at the diner, so I had the house to myself. I decided that I would surprise her and spend the day cleaning the hallway that leads to my bedroom. I worked for hours, threw out bags of disposable coffee cups, old newspapers no one ever read, and clothes that didn't fit anymore. I scrubbed the floor and cleaned the walls. I was so proud of what I was able to accomplish. I was so sure she would walk in dazzled by all the work I had done and realize if we did it together, we could clean up the rest of the house. When she arrived home, it felt like the world around me exploded. Instead of praises for all the hard work, she spewed vile hate at me while she threw my belongings on the front lawn. The last words I ever spoke to my mother were, "I hate you. You will never see me again," right before she shut the front door, slamming the lock in place. At the time, I had no idea how true those words would end up being. I don't know what drove me to come back here after the funeral. The house was nothing but rot and mildew. It shouldn't have been able to support itself, let alone life. And yet it did. My mother used to live here, tucked away in a little corner with all her prized possessions. The neighbors were the unfortunate ones to find her. They popped by last Monday after noticing she hadn't been to their thrift store in a week. Something that she hadn't missed in 15 years, they said. Her body was found in one of the livable spaces left in the old house. her 30-year-old lazy boy chair that reeked of piss and shit and stained with, much worse, was barely visible underneath the mountain of crumbling boxes they found her beneath. Her disease literally smothering her until she rotted alongside it. One would have thought that the smell would have alerted them that something was amiss, instead of the lack of purchases, but unfortunately, the house had always smelled of rot. That was actually my first memory of the house. The smell. It would seep up from the basement, through the floorboards and vents, an ever-present smell of decay and shit. The basement had always been off limits to me. I remember when we first moved in and she immediately installed a deadbolt on the old wooden door, one with a heavy metal knob. It was just out of reach for my 5-year-old arms, no matter how much I stretched or stood on my toes. I was told never to go into the basement. It was off limits, and I nodded like I always did when adults spoke in that serious tone. But I didn't understand the don't go in the basement rule. I wasn't afraid of basements, and in the last home we had before Daddy left, I was always allowed to play down there. We had been in the house for a month when I finally got up the courage to make my move. I was going to show Mom there was nothing to be afraid of in the basement, and she didn't have to cry at night anymore. It could be like it was before we moved into this stinky house. We could build forts, have camp-out nights together, sing songs, and have dance parties.
New York.
She caught me red-handed, standing on the wobbly kitchen stool, just as I had managed to unlock the deadbolt. Click! She lunged across the room, screaming at me to get away from the door with madness in her eyes. But I wasn't quick enough, and she threw her body against the wooden door. The stool and I went flying. I landed headfirst onto the hardwood floor, slicing my forehead open. I still have a small scar to this day. A constant reminder that nothing was ever going to be like before. That was the first and only time I ever tried to open the door to the basement. It took me years of therapy and 5 therapists to move past this house, to let go of the resentment, to forgive what she could not, and what she could not change. She had pushed me away years before. She kicked me out with her collections and clutter. She was consumed with consumption, her need to keep acquiring outweighing her need to mother.
Ladies and
standing outside the back door,
Mills.
I thought I had braced myself for the worst. I thought I knew what to expect, what it would be like.
We have a special statement
I wasn't.
from Mr. Harry McDonald.
No amount of preparation could have prepared me for what the house had become. A small, black, concrete deck was crumbling, littered in open bags of cat food and animal feces. Around the door, holes had been eaten clear through into the house by rodents, leaving perfect little doors for insects to pour into. The smell of decomposition was overwhelming, and my eyes began to burn and tear up. I mentally kicked myself for not buying a full-face respirator through Amazon Prime before I had left. Instead, all I had was a drugstore face mask I purchased on my way over from the funeral. I walked in and immediately realized nothing was salvageable.
Here's a bulletin from
The
State
house was
Reports.
full, floor to ceiling, with boxes and piles of garbage that took up
Professor
every piece
Pearson,
of space,
Ladies and gentlemen,
sucking up every
here's a
bit of
bulletin
air.
from Trenton.
Photos that
It is
were
a
once
brief
hung with
statement
pride were
informing
left to
us that the
decompose
charred
from the
body
damp on the
of Carl
walls.
Phillips has been identified
Roach
in the Trenton
carcasses
Hospital.
and what seemed to be
Now here's
endless
another bulletin
spider
from
webs,
Washington, D.C.
filled in the corners like a
Office of the
monstrous
Director of
haunted house.
National Red Cross
The
reports
only walkable
10
path
units of Red
was
Cross
from the back
emergency
door to her
workers
chair to the
have been
basement
assigned
door.
to the headquarters
But even
of the
those were
state militia stationed
piled
outside
almost knee
Grover
deep
Mills,
with
New
debris.
Jersey. Here's a
With one
bulletin
exception.
from State Police.
The path
Princeton
around the
Junction.
basement door was clear.
The fires at Grover Mills
A
and vicinity
perfectly
are now
clean
under
space.
control.
just big enough to allow the door to be opened without issue.
No sign of life appearing from the mouth.
I had unlatched the deadbolt, reaching for the handle before I realized this is why I came back to the house. Pulled by years of curiosity and an intense need to understand my mother even a little bit. To peek inside her broken
unable
mind.
to establish any
All I had
combined
to do
fire
was look.
departments.
The door swung open, creaking like
And
an
a message
old
came, The
tomb,
bodies burned
and I descended the wooden steps into the
I have been
depths.
requested by the governor of New Jersey
I grabbed
to
my
place the
cell,
counties of
turning on the
Mercer and
flashlight
Middlesex
as the
as far
small,
west as Princeton and
incandescent
east of
light bulb
Jamesburg under
at the
martial
top
law.
of the stairs
No
barely
one will be
pierced the
permitted to enter
darkness.
this area except by special
I
pass.
don't know
in
what I was
Middlesex.
expecting, but my heart sank when I reached the bottom step. The basement was much like upstairs, but it was so much worse. Rotting boxes of clothes and broken furniture, molding newspapers, and actual garbage was heaped throughout, festering in a pool of decomposing sludge. A small path had been left, a macabre labyrinth of decay leading me onward. I tried not to think about what I was wading through, ignoring the smell of fresh sewage as my funeral flat sunk down into the ankle-deep, cold, wet basement swamp. Ugh. I walked further than I expected to, the path leading me to a gap between old cement blocks in the foundation, a tunnel that didn't belong beneath an old 1930s bungalow. But I continued on, curiosity moving me forward deeper into the darkness. Soon the path opened up into a large cavern. The smell was even worse than before, and I tried not to gag as I scanned my surroundings. It was cold and damp and dark. The only perceivable light was from my cell, and I clung to it praying that the battery didn't die. The walls of the cavern, fur and bones clumped together, like giant owl pellets. It was in this cesspool of sewage and bones I saw it. A grotesque figure rose up from its throne of refuge, standing 7 feet bulbous frame. It was monstrous, with an immense belly, strong muscular arms, and claw-like hands. The beast stepped towards me, the light of my cell phone illuminating each pus-filled boil on its molten red skin. I watched, too frightened to move as its large black eyes took me in. Its wide, frog-like mouth curved into a maniacal smile, filled with sharp, pointed teeth. "So, you are the daughter." Its voice surprisingly deep and soft, like cool 90s jazz DJ. I turned to flee, but I lost my footing and stumbled in a pile of shit and bones. The beast lunged towards me. I dug my hands into the pile. I ran. I didn't have time to look behind me or think, only run. I jumped through the cavern entrance into the basement. I could hear his laughter behind me getting closer as he easily navigated the horde of garbage and decay. Its breath was hot on my neck. The stench of decay was overwhelming and my lungs burned with effort as I finally made it to the steps. I leaped, taking them 2 at a time. I'm not going to make it, I think, as I race up the rotting stairs, the beast on my heels. I jumped the last 2 steps to the main floor. A sickening scream and the sound of splintering wood startle me, and I spin around, grabbing the door tightly. Below me I saw the beast. Its massive weight had broken through the 8th step, only 5 steps shy of the top. The rotten slats had pierced its left side, pinning it within the stairs. Its paper-thin skin torn open. Black blood oozed from the wounds in a steady stream dripping into the basement beneath. It bellowed in pain, struggling to free itself but unable to get a footing, clawing at the last step for leverage, just inches away from me. I slammed the door and turned the deadbolt until I heard the loud click. I ran towards my mother's death chair, climbing over the fallen boxes and torn through her pile of bottles, looking for the ever-present vodka bottle, hoping she still had that same crutch after all these years. She did not disappoint. As quickly as I could, I poured the clear liquid on her chair of decay, splashing it on her stacks of old magazines and newspapers, her knick-knack collection of frickin' little wooden dolls, and the pile of shit-stained clothes along the countertops full of dried used tea bags and takeaway containers. And finally I threw it at the basement door. I screamed as it shattered, sending glass shards and liquid fuel throughout. I turned around to give my childhood home one last look and lit a match. I should have listened to her all those years ago when she told me never to go into the basement. My mother lived with her demons, feeding it meals of garbage, feral cats, and bits of her sanity. I only hope the fire kills it. So quoth this raven.
Welcome to Madame Ravens. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Silver City Sanatorium by C.J. Canatelli. Back in the beginning of 2009, I was one of 4 high school students who broke into what was once Undercliff Sanatorium in Meriden, Connecticut. This was, of course, the initiation into the elite group of outcasts in my high school. Basically, freshmen would go with a few seniors who would show them how to get in. The truth is, the cops do watch Undercliff, but not really. Twice a night, someone from the local police department drives around the building and back. The rules were simple. The freshmen had to be the first to go in, and they had to be the last to leave. There were plenty of noises going on throughout the building at all times, but most of which I would attribute to pipes that hadn't been active in decades. As I write this, I'm watching several urban exploration videos of the sanatorium. I'm unimpressed. At least, I always am, until the end of the videos. One of the 4 students, including myself, only Jenny and Molly actually saw what happened. I wasn't with them. I was with another senior. Let's go right ahead and call him Tom. I had the biggest crush on Tom. At least I thought I did. He ended up being a complete coward, which I find incredibly unattractive. We had 2 flashlights between the 4 of us. As any Scooby-Doo mystery gang would do, we split into 2 groups. A senior paired with each of us 2 freshmen. The other freshman left with the senior girl, Molly. They went towards the south side of the building, while Tom and I went north. It's a custom to go into Undercliff as a freshman. It's a rite of passage, so to speak. When you cut your hand on a rusty piece of metal or some broken glass, you go right up the road to the hospital for your traditional tetanus shot. Honestly, with the seniors in my school, everyone who went on this pilgrimage ended up getting a tetanus shot. I guess some girl got really sick a few years before, and now they make everyone do it. Responsibility to the responsible, or so they say. So, Tom and I went through 2 hallways. We actually found a wheelchair that was missing a wheel. If we weren't using 2009 cell phones, we probably would have taken videos the way urban explorers do on YouTube today. I honestly wish I'd been born later on. I would have had footage of this horrible noise. We went into a room that had a gurney on it. No, there wasn't a body or anything, just a whole lot of filth. This abandoned asylum was entirely not up to any form of legal building code, which probably explains why we were warned not to go in. Personally, what terrifies me the most was the way the walls would creak as you walk through this museum of someone else's nightmare. And you should remember that. Undercliff Sanatorium is nothing but the remnants of a time passed by that nobody wants to remember. But we do remember. Meriden will always be haunted by the things that went on there. According to Damned Connecticut, a website for all things effed up, a website for all the effed up things in my home state, Undercliff was originally a hospital to treat children suffering from tuberculosis. These children, tortured both by their affliction and their situation, either lived with horrendous trauma or died, leaving their souls to wait within the walls of the sanatorium. After that, Undercliff housed mental patients. This is all verifiable information, and you can go right ahead and look it up. These patients were exposed to dreadful living conditions. There are even rumors of torture. We didn't actually make it far into the building before we heard this thunderous rumbling coming from down the hall. Tom and I exchanged terrified glances, and I felt my heart creep into my throat and make a new home there. Tom bolted out of the door, and apparently the other kids heard it too, because they came running from the other side of the facility. I ran after everyone and ended up falling, cutting my knee on some shattered glass that rested upon the concrete floor. I earned my tetanus shot that night, and so did Jenny, the other freshman. Years passed, and I talked to Jenny once more after we graduated. We went to the same college for a time before she moved to Canada, and I finally got to discuss that night with someone who had been there. "You know what that noise was, don't you?" she asked, dragging her pen absent-mindedly across the wooden desk. "There was an old woman in a wheelchair. She rolled down the stairs to the basement. I don't think she was alive to begin with. The woman was, in fact, not alive, or at least I hope she wasn't, when she tumbled down those stairs to what had surely been her death. To this day, I hear that same noise when I watch certain videos floating around the internet of stupid kids trying to give themselves a scare. It appears this is a common occurrence, but nobody seems to identify it as the poor woman in the wheelchair reliving her final moments. The Melonhead Monsters of Meriden. Also by C.J. Canatelli. This story is actually really hard for me to write down. No words transcribed on paper or expletive-laced explanations can adequately describe the unmitigated and inscrutable terror of the night we went to Red Bridge Trail. This tale is true. I swear with all my heart and soul that this is exactly what happened to myself and my friend on that cursed Sunday evening. My friend Connor is probably the most laid-back guy you will ever meet. We've known each other since middle school. Ever since that night in the summer of 2017, we have found that we really don't have much to say to each other at all anymore. Every Sunday evening, Connor and I would go down to Red Bridge for a blunt walk. Before that summer, I would typically go on these weed-riddled walks myself. Red Bridge is a hiking trail that goes through several towns in Connecticut, to the best of my knowledge. It's this weird, off-the-beaten-path hiking trail a few blocks down from the high school. We call it Red Bridge because you have to park your car at this dinky excuse for a gravel parking lot. To get to the trail, you walk across a short red bridge. I would go here sometimes to get ideas to write. Of course, the trail closes at dark, but the paved tar path goes on forever. I've never run into any cops that deep into the wilderness. I'd walk down the trail because it would give me ideas for writing. Red Bridge had never let me down, and this story is evidence of that fact. One night I was chatting with Connor through text messages. We decided to head down there the next evening to go on a blunt walk. It was great. The trail was vacant, seeing as no one wanted to stumble around in the dark at 9 on a Sunday night. We talked about life, who we once were and who we had become. We deliberated our lives back in high school and whether or not we had actually made something of ourselves. We wondered if anything from our little subgroup of friends had actually made it out of Meriden. "You're a great writer," he told me. "Never change your stories for anyone." That was before, when the trees were still green and the night still engulfed in the youthful glow of the summer sun. In that moment, though in our 20s and unsure of our direction in life, we found peace in the path. We found destiny in the dark and dense forests that surrounded us. Those were the real glory days, we decided. Our lives were just starting, and the origin of our lives held no power over us. This became the norm for us. Every Sunday night at around 7, we would get together, drive down to Red Bridge, and enjoy a private smoke party on the road to nowhere. It was August. The trees were slowly dying around us in a mass funeral for summertime and the rebirth of the autumn season. It was humid. I wore a tank top and jeans while Connor wore his brightly colored tie-dye shirt. I'd like to point out that Connor never once put his hands on me, regardless of the opportunities he may have seen before him. We were isolated, and you can truly judge the character of a man when he's alone with a woman who has nowhere to run. I never in my life felt threatened by Connor. I don't think any woman ever has or ever will. Connor is a good guy, and I maintain that fact as I bear my truth for the world to see. We were not perfect, but our friendship was. Maybe it still is. I don't know. Life creeps up on you sometimes, like a man in a van with a free candy sign. Perhaps we're both busy, or perhaps this ruined everything. As we started our blunt walk, tiny drizzles of the late summer rain crashed to the pavement. Connor, being the nice guy he is, went to my car and got a hoodie for me. My phone was dying, but I didn't care. I felt safe out there in the wilderness with Connor. We got a mile into the trail before the world plunged into darkness. Connor ended up using his phone's flashlight most of the night. When I say the trail was blanketed in shadow, I damn well mean that. Within 20 minutes of being on the trail, it was impossible to see the road ahead of us. But we didn't care. We had 2 working lighters and a blunt to share between us. Suddenly I stopped walking. I heard some rustling in the brush to our right. Connor insisted it was nothing, but still, he shined his light in the direction of the sound to bring me a sense of security. We both followed the beam of light with our eyes, slowly and carefully. Anxiety flooding our veins and chilling us to the bone. Nothing. "It's nothing," Connor assured me. "It's nothing," I agreed, putting my paranoia aside. We walked another half-mile in. Connor's phone was dying, and we figured We should head back to the car. The night consumed us in our entirety. It would be impossible to see the path if that light died. Every now and then I would fall out of the ray of light and lose my footing, ending up in the mud several times. Connor never let me fall. He always guided me back to the path. About a quarter mile from the car, I held Connor's cell phone for light, because I was the clumsy one and was trying desperately not to sink into the mud outside the safety of the path. Then we both heard it. A vocal vibration emanating from the shrubbery around us. We figured the sound was coming from our left, or what had been our right on the way in. I cannot adequately describe the stark sense of terror I felt in that moment. The sound was something I had only heard once before. A relative was dying in the hospital, and moments before his heart flatlined, we heard the rattle of death coming from within his chest. If you don't know what the death rattle sounds like, look it up and listen to it. It's the worst sound you will ever hear in your life. It will plague your days with dread and taint your nights with terror. That's the closest thing I can compare this sound to. Connor put his hand on my arm and followed my gaze. I gasped as the light caught the eyes of a small creature hiding in the night. Its bulbous head tilted to one side more than the other. It was short, crouched, and completely naked. It honestly looked like a deformed child. I thought for a moment before it opened its mouth, letting out the ever-frightening death rattle from the bowels of hell itself. One thing I know for certain is that its long, repugnant tongue was completely blackened from God knows what. "Run!" Connor screamed, jerking my arm and pushing me in front of him. Connor's a pretty fit guy. I live a pretty stationary lifestyle, glued to my laptop for my work. He still never ran ahead of me. He kept me in front of him as we ran to the car. The creature did not actually come onto the path immediately. It rustled through the bushes with incredible speed, following alongside us as though it were locked in a track race. My breathing grew ragged and my eyes were blinded by what had become a steady and heavy downpour of rain. We made it to the car in about 2 minutes and got in. I didn't stop to turn around. Connor paused and stared through the bushes before getting into the car. I locked the doors and sped out of the bootleg parking lot towards the main road. That was it. We were silent for the entire 6-minute car ride to Connor's house. I wrapped him in the tightest hug of my life, which he reciprocated. I haven't seen him since. I know he's alive and well. I see his posts on Facebook every so often, but I'm afraid to interact. I think he's avoiding me. I can't blame him. He kept me safe that night, and for that I owe him my life. If he never wants to see me again, so be it. Act of respect to the man who risked his life for me. I miss you, Connor. I really do, and I'm sorry. I don't know why or what for, but I'm sorry. You've dragged a little too far into my campfire tale. I hope you can forgive me someday for whatever wrong I've done. In the weeks following this incident, I did a bunch of research about what it was we could have seen. This was in the general area of Undercliff Sanatorium, the location where the Melonhead urban legends hold its roots. According to Damned Connecticut, Melonheads are thought to be inbred backwoods people, a government experiment gone terribly wrong, or even cannibals who escaped Undercliff many years ago. What surprises me most is that while Melonheads have their origin in Connecticut, they have also been spotted in Michigan and Ohio. For the wilderness and a renewed respect for the man who was once my best friend.
So quoth this raven.
Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
A Man After My Own Heart by Bo Bandy. The new neighbors moved in next door, but I didn't think too much about it at first. I waved from my porch to instigate friendly relations, but I wasn't about to barge over there and become the welcome wagon. I'm more of a live and let live sort of neighbor, uninterested in embedding myself in other people's lives. The same was true for my preference about them. Friendly, but not real friends. Several months went by, and I was a little embarrassed to a man's first name from his wife calling it out from the driveway. Who names their child Lord, anyway? She was attractive in a creepy goth sort of way. I still didn't know her name. I dubbed her Elvira until I learned the truth. He's a tall, snazzy dresser, and their kids are average-looking, nothing out of the ordinary. I thought it was a bit odd when they put up Halloween decorations right after the 4th of July, but it seemed harmless enough. Some people really get into the party themes. Here was a family living next door to me, and I made almost no effort to get to know them. There's a fine line between being private and rude or uncaring, and I felt like maybe I'd crossed it a little. I worried my aloof behavior might have made them feel unwelcome. With a gregarious ambition, which I soon came to regret, I went over to introduce myself. Elvira answered the door. I made a mental note to ask her real name so I could stop mock-labeling her in my head. But it wasn't. Executioner's axes. The coldness of his eyes gave me an involuntary shiver. Then he added, "They're as dull as butter knives, so we had to quit using them. We use the axes now." Samuel glanced over to Lily to gauge her reaction to his provocative jest, but she betrayed no emotion. I got the feeling she was distracted by something troubling. My guess was that whatever it was would be far more troubling to me than to them. I desperately sought an excuse to skedaddle out of here, but my mind drew a total blank. Try as I might, I couldn't fabricate a good excuse to facilitate my departure, short of me abruptly leaping up and fleeing in abject terror. I was going to have to stick around a bit longer and tough it out. I could tell my morbid hosts were enjoying my wide-eyed reaction. They seemed to be feeding off the growing level of unease. It had the effect of actually encouraging both of them to increase their alarming banter. I was trying to play along. If there's one thing you learn growing up as the victim of bullies, it's that if they know something bothers you, they'll do it forever. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me squirm. I did my damned to pretend to be amused, while sweat beaded on my forehead. I'm not sure they were fooled by the paper-thin facade, but it was the best I could do. I wanted to turn the tables and creep them out for a change, but they had home court advantage. The two of them kept using clever metaphors and sick puns to vaguely suggest they intended to harm me. I was pretty alarmed by their twisted little mind game, but it was never so obvious as to qualify legally as an actual threat. There was always a more innocent interpretation that it could mean. Any rational person would have already excused themselves and hightailed it out of there, but I was determined to stick it out. I pushed past my paranoia and deepening fear. I had to live next door to these macabre ghouls. If I turned tail and ran, they'd have the upper hand at
every future contact I'd have with them. Lily feigned concern about my tense posture and body language. Then Samuel asked if I've ever been on a medieval torture rack before. Since I'd managed to rebuff their psychological threats, they were systematically pushing me towards a more physical intimidation. They worked as a cunning team, all the while with pleasant smiles on their emotionless faces. I couldn't begin to say what possessed me, but I stood right up and volunteered for a chiro. Had my answer. Reason, they were just showing me they were in control. We both knew it. I wanted to scream out. I wanted to piss my pants in agony, but somehow I kept it together. Finally, Lily released the rack, and my body sprang off it like a rubber band. I caught the two of them making eye contact. There was an unspoken air of respect. I was sure of it. Intense waves of pain radiated through my body as the tension was released so dramatically. But I did my best to pretend I enjoyed the whole exercise and torture. Instead of excusing myself, I sat back down on the couch. Part of that was because I was in so much pain I could barely stand. But I also wanted them to think I wasn't afraid of them. The three of us went right back to talking of regular things, without even skipping a beat. All the while, the most disturbing mind games imaginable continued. Believe it or not, we did have some genuine interests in common. I started to feel my fear and tension dissipate. Samuel asked about my hobbies and pastimes. After relating my interests that opened the door to reciprocation, I asked about theirs. Lily spoke up and admitted she had a consuming passion for studying the chemistry of potions and poisons. Samuel watched my reaction with obvious glee. I tried to pretend I wasn't